Picking up where we left off on Monday, we finished up the Transfiguration and the journey to Jerusalem, and we kind of left off right before Jesus is ready to enter into Jerusalem. And remember that ended with, talked about the end of that was Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead and spending about a week just outside of Jerusalem, about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem in a small town. It's either Bethphage or Bethany. I think it's Bethany. But he spends almost a week, few days in this town after raising Lazarus from the dead, and news about him spreads. And the last kind of thing was the religious leaders in Jerusalem convening the Sanhedrin and then discussing in the ruling council of Israel inside the Sanhedrin what to do about Jesus. And Caiaphas, the high priest, saying basically he has to die for the sake of all the people. And so we're going to seek an opportunity to arrest him and to kill him in order to keep unrest from happening and Rome from cracking down and killing us and destroying the temple. And so that's where we left off. So today we're going to pick up with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and then some of the things that happened during that week after, the several days after he enters into Jerusalem, that is sometimes called the Passion Week. So we got two terms for what we're going to be looking at today, basically, and that's the Triumphal Entry and the Passion Week. And if you're not super familiar with church, that's not something you've got a deep background in, or these terms may be a little unfamiliar and odd. So we'll explain them. Take a second to explain them. Basically, for the Triumphal Entry, the reason that it's called the Triumphal Entry is because when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, we're about to explore how he comes in and all the kind of trappings around it so that you'll understand why this term fits. But basically, people thought that he was coming in, and everything looked on that day like he was doing everything that the Messiah was expected to do, what everybody wanted the Messiah to do. They wanted this king to come in and to be this conquering hero, and he comes riding into town, and everybody kind of expects that he's going to be that. And so everybody is welcoming him in, and there's huge crowds shouting and yelling and screaming, and they're welcoming him in like he's a victorious hero, the coming king. And so it's triumphant. It looks like everything is going great. So he enters Jerusalem with celebration, the triumphal entry. And then after that, from that point on through the crucifixion is usually called the Passion Week. And the reason it's called the Passion Week is because the Passion has kind of an older use. We usually use it now to talk about like something really exciting or really emotionally, moving, to something that you're you have a strong desire for. You're very passionate about something. But the word passion in older times, earlier times, was used to refer to anything like any strong emotion or any kind of a strong change, either in body or in emotional state. And so if you were having a very strong emotion, you were suffering a passion. And so Jesus, because he suffers, he actually experiences pain, he suffers and dies, his death is often referred to as his passion. The crucifixion and the suffering that all the things that he suffered around the crucifixion are often described as the passion of Jesus. That's why if you go, look for a movie, this movie actually came out when I was in college, I would say, so like early 2000s, somewhere there. Mel Gibson was the director. It's called The Passion of the Christ, and it's actually a movie depicting Jesus' suffering and death. And so that's an old term for the suffering of Jesus. It's the passion of Jesus, the passion of Christ. And so the week leading up to that is often called the Passion Week, because most of the events that are in the Passion Week are celebrated by most churches, or by many churches, in the week leading up to Easter. Most churches have Easter is the celebration of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, and so most churches will also, in the week leading up to Easter, have celebrations for Good Friday, which is the day that Jesus is crucified. Kind of celebrates or remembers the day of Jesus' crucifixion. And then the several days leading up to that are celebrate the various things that Jesus did during this week. And so I've listed up several of them that we're going to look at this week or today. but that's the origin of the term Passion Week. And then the Sunday before, we celebrate the Triumphal Entry in many churches, and we call that Palm Sunday because of the crowds going and jerking branches off of palm trees to wave at him and to throw in the road as he's going by. But we'll get to those details in a minute. But that's the origin of these terms. The Triumphal Entry is because it's this big moment of celebration, and it's gonna turn bad later in the week. Things are gonna go dark by the end of the week. But for this moment, at least, it's celebration. It's party. So it's a triumphal entry. And then the Passion Week is because it ends with Jesus' passion or his suffering and death. So let's look at the content or what actually happens during the triumphal entry. Of course, all four Gospels have an account of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and so they all record slightly different sets of details. And some of those details are, pretty obvious that once you know what the Gospel author is looking for. For example, Matthew. Matthew is always trying to show Jesus as the fulfillment of the promises regarding the Messiah. Jesus is the promised coming king, the Messiah that God promised to send. And so one of the hallmarks of Matthew is to show from the Old Testament, to quote Old Testament passages that show how Jesus is fulfilling all of these promises. And so Matthew, of course, includes a reference to an Old Testament text that Jesus is specifically fulfilling by the way that he enters Jerusalem. Luke just gives extra details that aren't in anybody else's, and Mark is brief and to the point. So the description of the scene is Jesus has been staying in this village just outside of Jerusalem for a few days, and now he's coming to the city. And it's about a week, several days before the beginning of the Passover celebration, which is one of the major Jewish holidays. And we'll talk more about the Passover and why it's significant on Monday when we start talking about Jesus' arrest and trials, on into the next Wednesday when we talk about the crucifixion. But it's almost time for the Passover, which is the biggest celebration or the biggest festival of the year. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of Jewish people have come to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. And so Jesus is coming, and as he's approaching the city, he decides that this is going to be kind of the big entry. And he's come into Jerusalem many times before without all this fanfare, but he knows that this time is special. And he's coming in and he is fully claiming, he's not hiding his role or his status as the Messiah anymore. He's coming into the town, coming into the city, fully claiming his status as Messiah. And so he comes in, and as he's approaching the city, he sends two of his disciples ahead of him into the next town, the town that's a little bit closer to the city, and asks them to go and find a donkey that's been tied up in front of somebody's house. And so somebody's got a donkey tied up in front of their house, and Luke makes it clear that it's not just the donkey, there's the colt, the young donkey, and its mother tied up together. And says, go and get those. Go and get the colt and his mother. And if anybody challenges you or asks what you're doing, tell them the Lord needs it. It's okay. And so two of the disciples go, they find the colt and its mother tied up, and so they untie it and they start to leave with it, and the owner comes out and says, hey, what are you doing with my donkeys? And they say, it's okay, the Lord needs it. And the guy lets them go with the donkeys. Now this is kind of surprising because donkeys are like a beast of burden or a labor animal. They're used to plow fields, they're used for transportation, they're kind of important and kind of valuable. And so for a guy to just let them wander off because they said it's okay, the Lord needs it, is a little surprising. This guy, whoever owned these donkeys, must have had some sense of what was going on and that Jesus was coming, and that, when they said the Lord needs it, he's willing. But they lead the donkeys back, and Jesus gets on the colt. And we're told in some of the stories that the colt has never been ridden on before. At least I think two of the Gospels make it clear that the colt has never been broken, it's never been ridden on. And some of the disciples take off their outer garments, their cloaks, the kind of outermost layer of their clothing, and they toss it over the back of the donkey. And Jesus climbs up on this colt, and climbs up as kind of, that may be giving it more credit than it's due, because a horse is fairly tall, right? Most horses are fairly tall. You climb up on a horse, you got a higher vantage point. Your head goes up a good bit. Depending on how big the horse is, it can go up quite a bit. You get on a pony, it's less, right? Because the pony's only, about as tall as your waist anyway, and so when you sit on it, it's only raising you up a few inches. Donkeys are shorter than a lot of horses, and the colt, or the foal of a donkey, the younger donkey, would have been even shorter. So I kind of imagine Jesus just kind of swinging a leg over the animal and then his head not really moving. And here he is sitting. It didn't raise up. He's not raised above the crowd very much. But he sits on this donkey and starts to ride into Jerusalem. And the crowds start chanting and shouting. And people are taking off their garments and throwing them across the street so that the donkey doesn't actually touch the dirt of the road. And people are tearing palm branches off of the trees and waving them and shouting and throwing the palm branches down in front of him in the road. And so it's this big celebration and a whole lot of noise. And the people start shouting out these phrases. And they're shouting out, Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David! Hosanna in the highest! Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord! And that phrase, that blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, is a direct quotation from the Old Testament, from Psalm 118, actually. And if you go back and you read Psalm 118, it's referencing the coming of the King. And so they're shouting out this quotation from the Psalm. And when they shout Hosanna, the word Hosanna is actually a translation of a Hebrew phrase that means save us. It's a Hebrew phrase that means save us, rescue us. But by this time, by the first century, it was often being used as a cry of celebration or of joy. And so it's basically kind of, we're crying out, save us, but the moment indicates that salvation has already come, or that we've already gotten what we were asking for. And so it's kind of a shouting out of celebration that what was originally a cry for help. And so they're shouting out, Hosanna, blessed is the King, the Son of David. And then Matthew records Jesus, this passage from the Old Testament from Zechariah, one of the minor prophets. In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, he records this phrasing from Zechariah that shows how Jesus is fulfilling this Old Testament prophecy, or this Old Testament promise regarding the coming of the Messiah. And Zechariah 9:9 says, say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so it's very oddly specific about the king coming riding into Jerusalem, riding a young donkey. And so Jesus comes riding in, and this moment is doing several different things. One, it is fulfilling this kind of Old Testament scripture, these Old Testament promises about what the Messiah was supposed to do. And people are recognizing it and celebrating it, and it's a huge celebration of the Messiah coming to the city. But there's also an element of irony and kind of mockery of other kings going on here. There are stories of the Roman emperor coming back after a battle or after a trade delegation. Just the emperor was out of Rome, traveling, doing something on behalf of the empire, and then coming back. Or one of the generals is out of Rome, and they're traveling, they're fighting, and then they come back. And when they come back after a big battle, after a major victory, there's this grand procession into the city. And the emperor or the general will sit on this big, grand, great-looking horse or some other animal or steed. I think there's a story about one of the emperors coming riding in on an elephant because, you can't get much taller than an elephant to ride on. And so it comes riding in on this majestic animal, really showing the status and the power of the emperor or the general. And comes riding in, and behind him, following him behind him, will be all of the military, the soldiers, the soldiers of the Roman legions, and they're looking good. They got their weapons in hand. They're wearing their armor. Everything's bright and polished. Makes the general or the emperor look strong. And if he can command all of these, nobody can stand against it. Look strong and powerful. And then trailing behind that would be servants or a long train of carts, and just people and animals and carts carrying all of the goods and all of the wealth that the general or the emperor had secured in his travels, either by fighting and winning or by making good trades or whatever. all the stuff that they had gotten that will enrich Rome or enrich the city is brought in, and they ride in and show off all of this wealth that's been acquired. And then behind them, if it was a battle, very often there would be a train of slaves that were taken in battle, again, showing the wealth and the power and the prestige of the king, or the general, the great person that's being lauded by this grand procession. And that was, a thing. That was something that happened. And in those cases, people would put things out in the streets, and they might roll out a grand carpet so that the blessed feet of the emperor or the great general wouldn't have to touch the dirty ground, right? And so Jesus is coming riding in, and he's going to do all of that, but he's going to do it in a way that makes fun of all of that. And so instead of on a grand steed, like an elephant or a great big, healthy, strong horse, he's going to sit on a baby donkey and ride in. And baby donkeys are just not that impressive looking. They're actually kind of funny looking. And so he's riding in, and he doesn't even have a saddle. It's just his disciples' clothes thrown over its back. And he's sitting on that. And then behind that are going to walk the disciples that some of them now aren't fully dressed because they've just thrown their clothing over the back of the donkey. And so he's got his bedraggled disciples instead of a Roman legion, right? Instead of a military force behind him. And so, and of course there's no slave train, there's no wealth behind him. And instead of rolling out any kind of grand carpet to keep his feet from touching the ground, people are just tossing their clothes and whatever scraps of cloth they can find, or tearing limbs off the trees and then putting the tree limbs across the road. All of that to bring the king in. And so if you think about the contrast between the way that Jesus enters Jerusalem and the way that the emperor entered Rome, it's comical. I mean, it's almost like he's intentionally mocking some of this stuff. And so he rides in, and his disciples are with him, and the crowds are shouting, and they're saying all the things that they're saying. Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed be the King who comes in the name of the Lord. And in the crowd, there are some Pharisees, and these Pharisees start to get on to Jesus and tell him to call down his disciples and make them stop shouting, and to quiet down this crowd. Maybe they're afraid that Rome's going to crack down on them. Maybe they just don't like the idea of people shouting to Jesus that he's the Son of David and the Messiah. Whatever their reason, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, make your disciples stop. Rebuke your disciples." And then Jesus replies back to them and says, if I tell them to be quiet, if they were quiet, the stones in the city would shout. And this, whether you think that Jesus is saying that this is something that would literally happen if the disciples had stopped speaking, and that we would have literally heard the stones shout, or he's just making a kind of point, using kind of hyperbolic point, or saying something hyperbolic to make a point. Regardless of whichever way you think that is, basically what Jesus is saying is that if the people were quiet, this moment is so big, it's a moment that the Old Testament had been pointing to, the coming of the Messiah to Jerusalem, the king that God had promised coming into town. This moment has been so longed for and so looked forward to that if the people didn't recognize it, then the city itself would. The city has been waiting for her king, even if the people didn't recognize his coming. And so this basically he's saying this is a moment. I mean, this is a big moment that nobody should miss. The city itself would recognize this moment if the people weren't. And then as he comes into the city, as he looks at it and he's coming into the town, he kind of pauses for a moment and he starts weeping over the city, because he looks at it and he realizes what's going to happen to it. That they are going to reject him, that they aren't going to accept him, the city as a whole is not going to recognize him as the Messiah, and that the end result of their rejection of him is going to be the city's destruction and the temple being totally laid low so that not even two stones were left on top of another. And so he tells them that, and tells them that's going to happen. Now this is one of the places out of several during the Passion Week. We're not going to look at all of them, but this is one of several places in various Gospels that Jesus kind of foretells something that's going to happen to Jerusalem or to the surrounding area. And a lot of people take the things that Jesus said then and apply them to some mysterious future apocalypse or something that's going to happen way off in the future. And some of it may very well apply that way. But then some of it doesn't. Some of it is about something that was going to happen in the relatively near future in Jesus' day, and that is well in our past now. In the year 70 AD, Rome was going to come and attack Jerusalem, and they were going to destroy it. And They would come and they would kind of wipe out much of the city. They would destroy much of the city, and then the temple itself would be dismantled stone by stone. And the reason that they dismantled the city, or the temple stone by stone, was that they had actually mixed gold into the mortar between the bricks. And so that there was gold even in between the blocks, even between the bricks or the blocks that made up the temple. And soldiers wanted to get to the gold. And so they would knock over literally every stone, so that there was no stone on top of another, so that they could get to the mortar between the bricks to extract the gold from it. And so what Jesus says here, and what he says in a couple of other places in the other Gospels, actually does end up happening to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed, and the temple is laid totally flat. But Jesus gets through, and after this scene, after he comes through and he has entered into Jerusalem, he moves into this kind of next scene, the clearing of the temple. And Matthew and Luke don't give a time frame for how much time has passed between the entering of the city and the clearing of the temple. And so the impression you get from reading them is that it's just immediate. Jesus comes in and rides straight into the temple and does these things. Mark's gospel records that Jesus comes in, and after the triumphal entry, he comes into the city, and he looks around and he sees all that's going on in the temple compound, the Temple Mountain inside the city, and then he turns around, because it was late, he turns around and leaves and goes back to the Mount of Olives, and then comes back the next day. And so Mark records that the clearing of the temple and all that follows that comes the day after. It starts on the next day, not on the day of the triumphal entry. And so now we're into the Passion Week stuff. And so Jesus comes, and he is coming back into the city after having seen kind of what was going on the night before. And he looks over and he sees this fig tree. And this first list right here, the clearing of the temple and the fig tree, the stuff that's going to happen here is going to be kind of jarring to us. It's stuff that Jesus is going to do that doesn't really mesh with or fit with most of our impressions of who Jesus is. So hang on, and you'll hopefully be able to understand by the end of it why he does what he does. But when Jesus looks and he sees this fig tree, it's big, it's bushy, it's got plenty of good leaves on it. It looks like it's a very good, very healthy tree. And so he goes over to the tree because he wants some figs. And so he's going to pick figs off, and he gets there, and there are no figs on the tree. Looks good, very, very bushed out, plenty of leaves, but there's no figs. And so Jesus says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," and curses the tree. And the disciples will come back a little later and find that the tree is dead. It is shriveled, it's gone. So that they're going to go in, they're going to do what they're going to do in the city that day, and then on their way back out of the city, the disciples are going to look at it and see the tree is dead. And so this is the only miracle of destruction that we see Jesus do. I mean, every other thing that we see him do, he's either exhibiting some ability or some power that people don't normally have, like walking on water or calming the storm or turning water into wine. He's either showing something, demonstrating something that other people can't do, or he is healing or adding to something. He's healing someone, either by casting out demons or healing an injury or a birth defect, people that are born blind or mute or deaf, whatever, or lame, or he raises the dead. That's another option. And so all of these different things that Jesus does, none of them are destructive. But there's this one miracle, this one moment where Jesus does something and destroys this tree. It dies as a result of his curse. And that miracle of destruction is jarring. To a lot of Christians, people that read the rest of Jesus' life, this miracle of destruction is kind of jarring. But then after he curses the fig tree, and before the disciples recognize that it's dead, he goes on into the temple. And when he comes into the temple, he finds stuff going on, and he sees all these money changers and all of these people buying and selling things in the temple. And so he starts flipping over tables and throwing people's merchandise to the ground and throwing it all out of the temple. And John's gospel actually has him twisting together a bundle of reeds, like a bundle of plants, to make a kind of whip to chase people out. And so he's whirling this whip that he's made out of weeds above his head and running at people and chasing them out, chasing out these money changers and these merchants and flipping their tables over and ruining their merchandise and all that stuff. And so this is like the only act of violence that we see Jesus do in the Gospels. So what is with these things? I mean, these are very contrary to what we think of Jesus as. And so what's he doing? Why is he doing these things? Well, we need a little background, and so I have drawn a kind of diagram of the way that the temple was set up. And so the temple, if you went into the temple compound, there was a city around it, and part of the temple was against the outer wall of the city. And so some of the gates of the temple were also gates into the city. But when you came into the temple, the first area that you could get to was this outermost court that was called the Court of the Gentiles. And this was if you were not born Jewish, this is the only part of the temple that you're allowed to go into. And there's this kind of barrier or this divider that's set up that blocks access to the inner parts of the temple, the rest of the temple. And so if you're a Gentile, this is the only area you're allowed to go into. Right? And as you go further and further in, you get closer and closer to the most holy place, which is this innermost area here that is where God's presence is supposed to be. It's where the Ark of the Covenant is. It's the most holy place in Judaism, in Israel, in the world, to Jewish people. And so as you go further and further in, it's more and more restrictive who can be there. And so for this outermost area, anybody can come into this part as long as you're there to worship. And so this is the Court of the Gentiles. And then you can come into this next area, and there's an enclosure, and this is called the Court of Women, because women could come in only this far. And if you were a Jewish man, then you could come on into the Court of Israel, this next intersection. And then from there, only the priests, and if they were dealing with a particular, a Jewish man could approach this, if his offerings were being offered, if his sacrifices were being offered, he could approach to see the sacrifice. But this area was called the Court of Priests, and this is where the altar was, and where the sacrifices were offered, and where incense was, or some of the incense at least, was burned. And then if you went in past the altar, there was the holy place, abbreviated here HP. And incense was burned in here. This is where Zechariah was burning incense when he was told that John the Baptist was going to be born to his wife, and he didn't believe it and all that. And then beyond that is the most holy place. And that area, only the high priest can enter, and that only on one day of the year, because that is where God's presence is. And so that's very restricted. You don't go in there. And so that's the setup, right? This is how the temple is set up. Well, in the first century, during the time that Jesus was coming in, and when he goes in and he finds what's going on in the temple, what was happening was that the court of the Gentiles had been, traders and merchants had been allowed to set up inside of the court of the Gentiles. They'd been allowed to set up in there to buy and sell things that were related to worship in the temple. And so instead of having an area where you could just worship if you were not Jewish, there were all of these merchant booths set up, like little tents and tables and things set up, so that all of these merchants could buy and sell on them. And they were buying and selling animals and things that were related to worship in the temple, grain and all kinds of stuff that was related to worship in the temple. And so, have any of you been to the Middle East, been to Israel or anywhere else in the Middle East, or in any culture that has like a marketplace where people like open air buy and sell things, and there's lots of people shouting out and making, trying to sell, and so you've seen some of that stuff? Well, my wife and I got to go to Israel right after I graduated seminary in 2011, so it was 2012 that we got to go. And while we were there, we went into Jerusalem, and in the old city, which is near where the temple compound is, this is still very much the way things are. People will just set up tables out in the street and out in front of their shop places. And if you go down one of these crowded streets that has all these shops on each side of it, it's like an old marketplace, and it's noisy, y'all. I mean, there's always sound. It's always loud, because there's always people haggling over prices, and they get passionate when they're haggling, when they're debating about the price. And so sometimes somebody will be just yelling at somebody else, and then a few minutes later they'll shake hands and they've made a deal, but it's just loud. And so there's all this talking and debating and arguing over prices going on, and that's just part of the marketplace culture. But not only that, but much of what was being bought and sold in this marketplace was animals, because a lot of what was happening in the temple had to do with sacrifices, and animals were what was sacrificed. And so if you wanted to, you could wait until you got to the temple to buy the animal to sacrifice. It didn't necessarily have to come from your own flock or your own herd. It just had to be yours, and you offered a sacrifice. And so you would wait until you got there to buy it. But that meant that out in this courtyard area, in the court of the Gentiles, people were buying and selling all of the various animals that were offered as sacrifices. And so if you remember back to when Jesus was being dedicated, his parents were offering either 2 doves or 2 young pigeons. And so there's all these birds in cages waiting to be bought to be sacrificed. And they're fluttering around and chirping, making all kinds of, all the noises that they make. And then also there's those lambs, the sheep and goats that are offered as sacrifices. And they're making all their noises, and they're doing what animals do and pooping all over the place. And so the whole area is not just full of noise and sounds of animals, but now smells of animals as well. And in addition to that, they were running scams. There were some of these merchants that were running scams in the temple court. And so let's say that you were a farmer, or that you were a herdsman, you were a shepherd, and you were coming to the temple to worship. And you had raised a lamb from the time it was born, and you looked at it, and it looked clean. It looked like it was good. It was a worthy animal to be sacrificed in the temple. And so you bring it into the temple, and that is a thing. The animals had to be spotless. They had to be without blemish in order to be offered in the temple, to be offered as a sacrifice to God. They had to be good animals, which mostly meant that they were spotless or without blemish. And so you bring your animal that you think is good into the temple, and when you get in there, somebody stops you, somebody that looks official stops you and says, look, your animal, you can't sacrifice that in the temple. That there's this blemish here. You see, look, one leg is slightly shorter than the others. You can't offer that animal here. And so they say, well, look, go over to this booth over here, and they will buy your blemished animal from you for some money. They'll give you some money for your blemished animal, and then you can go over to the next stall and buy an animal that has already been certified, already been shown to be unblemished and worthy to sacrifice. And so they would go over and they would sell their animal for way less than it was worth. Way less than it would have cost them anywhere else. And they move over to the next stall to buy an animal that was way more expensive than it was worth because it had already been certified as unblemished or able to be sacrificed. And they would take their new animal into the temple to sacrifice it. Well, behind the scenes, you got these two stalls, and the stall that had just bought the blemished animal would then turn around and push the animal on over into the next stall to be sold as an unblemished animal to the next country rube that comes in and can be deceived. And so they were literally just robbing people, running these scams to strip people of their money when they came into the temple. Not only that, but the temple required that you use a particular kind of currency. You had to use a particular kind of money when you were in the temple. And if you came from anywhere outside of Jerusalem, you probably didn't have that kind of currency. You were probably using the typical Roman currency or another kind of currency from wherever you were from. So you come into the temple, and if you're going to buy or sell anything in this marketplace, or you're going to offer any of that money inside the temple, you have to have the temple currency. And so you have to go to a money changer, who is also set up here in the court of the Gentiles, and you have to exchange the money you brought for the money that they use. And these money changers could charge basically whatever they wanted to. They could charge an exorbitant rate to exchange your money for the temple money. And so that was just one more way that people were being ripped off. When they came into the temple to worship, they wanted to come and to worship God, to give their best to God. And they came in and they had this wall of people that were doing everything they could to strip them of every dime they could, every scrap of cash that they could on their way through before they got to the temple into the temple to actually worship God. And that's what Jesus sees when he comes in. When he walks into the temple, he hears all of this racket, all of this incredible noise, all of the animals bleating and chirping, and all the noise that they're making, and the smells that they're making, and all of the merchants hawking their wares and shouting out prices and arguing to haggle. And he knows, or he sees, some of these bad deals going on, some of these thieving practices going on, the scams that they're running to try to rip people off their money, to make a few extra dollars or a little extra money. And he sees all of this going on, and that's what he reacts to. This one area of the temple, the only area that a non-Jewish person can come into and worship God, has been overtaken by all of this noise and all of this thieving, and there's nowhere left for somebody that's not Jewish to come in and worship. Nobody that is not Jewish can come in and worship God, worship his Father in the temple because of all of this. And none of this could happen. It's inside the temple. It is in the court of the Gentiles. None of this could happen if the Jewish religious leaders weren't allowing it. If the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, if they weren't allowing this to happen, it couldn't happen. And so Jesus he runs in, he comes into the temple, and he starts shouting, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations?" And he's quoting from Isaiah there. He says, is it not written that my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, not just for Israel, all nations? What area is most affected? The one that all the nations could actually come to. My house is a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers, a den of thieves, is the older translation people are more familiar with. And that is a quote from Jeremiah chapter 7, actually. And so Jesus says, this is supposed to be a place of prayer for all people, for all nations, and you have turned it into a place to steal and rob one another, to steal from each other. And so he's flipping tables, he's smashing merchandise, he's chasing people out. And once he's got everybody driven out, once everybody that's not supposed to be there is out, all the merchants are gone, he sits down, nice and calm, and starts teaching. Teaching people his teachings, just sharing his teachings like nothing happened. You know. And the religious leaders come out shortly after that. You know, some of the Jewish leadership come out and say, who gave you the right to drive off all these people that we had given permits to be here? You know, the religious leaders of Jerusalem, the leaders of the temple, the chief priests gave these people permission to be here. Who are you to chase them out? And Jesus, as tells them, basically his response is, and this is going to be used against him later, he says, if you destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And all the gospel authors are real clear that he's talking about his own body, because he knows that they're going to have him killed, and on the third day he's going to rise again. And so he's talking about his own body, and he says, you destroy this temple the third day, I'll build it again. I'll raise it up again. And of course the religious leaders are standing in the temple, and they think he's talking about the temple, which is, probably Jesus was intentionally cultivating this understanding. But he says this, and they respond back. He's like, really? Our ancestors took decades to build this place. Our fathers took decades to build this place. And you're going to raise it in 3 days. And so they laugh at him and mock him. But later, they're going to bring in, when they arrest him, when they put him on trial, they're going to bring in these witnesses, false witnesses, that are going to twist what he said here and say, they're going to say that he said, I will destroy this temple and in 3 days build it again. And so they're going to portray him as having said he was threatening the temple. And that's the accusation that they're going to make against him when they arrest him. And we'll see that when we look at it on Monday. We're going to look at the arrest and trials of Jesus. And so Jesus, he turns over the tables, he drives them out, and then he tells them, they come in and they say, what are you doing all this? What authority do you have to do this? It says, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And then after he gets done teaching that day, he goes back out. And as he's leaving, the disciples look and they see the fig tree that he cursed and see that now it is withered and died. And there's a link. We got Jesus' only kind of violent act, the only thing that he does that's really violent in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and the only miracle that he performs is destructive, when he curses the fig tree, and they're right together. And there's a reason for that. They go together. Right? He's doing something intentional with the fig tree that has to do with what he saw in the temple. And so he curses the fig tree, and it withers and dies. And why does he curse the fig tree? Because when he goes up to it, it looks fine from the outside. It has plenty of leaves. It looks like a good, healthy tree, but there's no fruit on it. And of course, if you read Mark, it's because it's not the right time of the year, Mark says. It's not the season for figs. There are different seasons for figs, and there's some fruit that's available on a fig tree at different times of the year, that even outside of the fully ripe fig time. But one way or another, there's no figs on it, because it's not the right time. But Jesus is going to use this tree as a kind of living parable, or enacted parable of what's happening in the temple, what's happening with the Jewish religious system. Like the tree, the temple looks good from the outside. It has all of this procedure, all of the people, all of the Jewish religious leaders and the chief priests and all of those that work in the temple make it look really good. It's a really polished system. It works real well for them, but it only works real well for them. It doesn't work real well for anybody else. People that are coming in order to worship God are being fleeced and stripped and robbed on their way in, and the religious leaders know about it. And in fact, they're kind of getting a cut because they're taxing the merchants. And so the more that the merchants take, the more that they get. And the Gentiles have no place to come and worship God. And so even though the temple looks good, the temple system looks really good, it's a big, grand, beautiful building, it actually doesn't produce any fruit. There's nothing that people can live off of. There's nothing that sustains or nourishes people happening there because of all of the corruption that's happened. And so Jesus uses a connection, he's making a connection between the fig tree and the temple system. It looks good on the outside, but there's nothing fruitful in it. And so when he curses the fig tree and he says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again, and it shrivels and it dies, basically what Jesus does is he curses it so that all the leaves fall off. And now from a distance, standing back, you can look and see what it is. It's a tree with no fruit. And when he goes and he flips over the temple, the tables, and he does all that he does, he's exposing the temple for what it is. Or the way that it had become at that time, the corruption that had happened to it. He's exposing it for what it is. It's without fruit. And that's the reason, that's the connection between the fig tree, the miracle of destruction, and the clearing of the temple, the one violent or semi-violent act that Jesus does. There's actually no recording of Jesus actually hitting anybody with his weapon. He just waves it around and people get scared and run off. So that's the first chunk. Then the second lump here is the conflict with the religious leaders escalates. Jesus, after this scene with the temple and the fig tree, now the Jewish religious leaders are out to get him for sure, and the first kind of approach to that is to discredit him. They want to make him look bad in front of the people so that if they arrest him later, they're justified in doing it. If they can discredit him now, then they don't have to worry so much about what the crowd thinks if they arrest him and kill him. And so they start sending groups to him to challenge him and to ask him questions that they think have no good answer so that they can accuse him no matter what he says. And so the first big question that comes like this, the first thing that they ask is a group of Herodians and Pharisees come together to ask Jesus about paying taxes to Caesar. Now, the Herodians are the group that think that they should compromise with Rome in order to fit in better so the Romans will leave them alone. And that's the way to get to protect the Jewish people. And the Pharisees think that the way to protect the Jewish people and to advance their cause is to lean hard into their old traditions to make sure that everybody's following the old traditions as well as they can, as often as they can, in every way that they can. And if they do that faithfully enough, God will bless them and send the Messiah to rescue them. And so both groups kind of have as their motive or their basic motive to thrive in the world that they live in. But they have very different ways to go about it. One is to compromise with the major culture, and the other is to really ace their own culture and wait on God to rescue them. And so they're kind of natural enemies, but here they're going to work together. They're going to work together to try to trap Jesus. And so they ask him, they come and they butter him up first, and then they ask him, should we pay taxes to Caesar? You know, Caesar is the oppressor, the one that's causing all of our issues, causing all of our problems. It's the Romans that are here that are causing all these issues. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And this is a trap because presumably you got to answer this yes or no. You should or you should not pay taxes to Caesar. And if he says yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, well, the people hate Rome, right? And they expect Jesus to be there to throw Romans out, but they hate Rome and they think that they're the major problem. And if they pay taxes, if they give money to Caesar, then they are building Caesar up, or they're making it easier for him to survive, making it easier for him to live and do what he does. So they're building up Caesar if they pay taxes. And so if Jesus says, yes, pay taxes, then people are gonna hate that. And that's going to be something that the Pharisees can use against him. On the other hand, if he says, no, don't pay taxes, well, the Romans are going to hear that, and they're going to say, well, this is sedition. He's inciting a rebellion. Don't pay your taxes? If you don't pay your taxes, you're going to get killed. Rome's going to come after you. So if he commands the people, tells the people, no, they don't have to pay taxes, a few minutes later, the Romans are going to be knocking on his door to arrest him. And so the Pharisees and the Herodians together, they're thinking, no matter what he says, no matter how he answers this question, we got something on him. And so Jesus calls them out on their trap and says, why are you trying to trap me? And then he says, bring me a coin that's used to pay the tax. Bring me one of the denarius, one of the coins that's used to pay the tax. And so they bring the coin, and he holds it up and looks at it and says, whose picture is this? Whose face is on this coin? And whose inscription? Who is the inscription written to on the coin, written around the face? You know, kind of like in the quarter, you got a president's face and then a set of words around it, right? It's similar thing. So whose is this? Whose coin is this? Whose face is on it? Whose inscription is on it? And they say, well, Caesar's, obviously. And so Jesus says, basically, it's already his coin. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And so, sure, give Caesar back his coin, but give your allegiance to God. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And that is a subtle and nuanced enough answer, and is way more profound than either of the other two answers, enough that it shocks the Herodians and the Pharisees, and they don't have another question to ask him. They're surprised by his response. and he has escaped the trap. And so then the Sadducees come, and the Sadducees ask a question, and their question has to do with the resurrection. And that's a little funny because the Sadducees are the group that doesn't believe in a resurrection. They don't think that God does miracles anymore, that God doesn't do any kind of supernatural anything, and that God hasn't really spoken to the people of Israel since the days of Moses. And so they don't believe in a resurrection. But they come and they say, Moses gave us this rule, or these laws, that say that if a man marries a woman and he dies without children, then his brother should marry his widow, his wife, and produce children in his name. And so then they come up with this, they cook up this hypothetical scenario. And that was, by the way, a real tradition. It's called levirate marriage. And the purpose behind it was to make sure that if a man died and he had other family, that his name could continue on through his children, and that the inheritance that was to come to his family through him could still be passed down, and that the widow would have someone to care for her, take care of her. Because in a culture that was pretty male-dominated, it was hard for a woman to provide for herself financially if she didn't have any men in their family that were willing to help her, take care of her. And if she died childless, then she didn't have any sons to do it. And so, if she married her dead husband's brother, she would at least be taken care of. And so that was a real tradition. But now the Sadducees are going to make up this really far-fetched hypothetical situation to try to trap Jesus in saying something. And so they make up this situation. They say there are these 7 brothers, and the oldest one, or the first brother, marries a woman, but then he dies without having any children. And so his next brother, marries her. And so the second brother marries her, and then he also dies without having any children. And then the third brother marries her, and he also dies without having any children. And that happens to all 7 brothers all the way through. All of them die childless, and then the woman herself dies. And then they say, who is going to be her husband in the resurrection? Who is really going to be her husband in the resurrection? Which one of them was the real marriage? And of course, if Jesus answers, any one of them was a real marriage, then he's going to be saying basically that whole levirate marriage system, that whole tradition was a sham, that only one of those marriages was really real, and that would be, insulting the law, acting against the law. And so Jesus says, instead of picking one of the brothers and saying that one was the real marriage and the rest of them weren't, Jesus tells them, you're clueless. You don't know what you're talking about. No one's going to be married in the resurrection. People aren't going to be given or taken in marriage in the resurrection. Instead, they'll be like the angels. And then he turns around and says, and by the way, the Torah proves that there's a resurrection, that there is life after death, because God says, when he's talking to Moses in Exodus, he talks about the characters in Genesis, and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He says, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He talks about them in the present tense, as though they are still there. And so if God talks about them in the present tense, and God is God of the living and not the dead, then the resurrection is certainly going to happen. You don't know what you're talking about. And so then the Sadducees are shut up. They don't know what to say anymore. And so another man, a teacher of the law, comes up, and he's seen them give this question. Jesus answered them. And in Mark, at least, this is portrayed as the man actually has a genuine question. He says, what is the most important commandment in the law? And most of the people are probably expecting Jesus to pick one of the 10 commandments, and then the religious leaders can use that to say, he's neglecting all the others. Whichever one he picks is going to be, he's neglecting the rest. And so Jesus instead quotes from the best known passage in the Old Testament. Like every Jewish boy had to learn and memorize this passage to quote it back as part of the ceremony to become a man. Right? It's called the Shema Israel. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. And it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And so he quotes like basically every child's bedtime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. Every kid knows this. But it's also one of the most profound and summarizing passages for the law in the Old Testament. Because now all of the law that has to do with relationship with God is summarized in this one passage. And then he quotes and says the second is like it from Leviticus 19:18. It says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, which then encapsulates everything that has to do with how you treat other people. Which, between those two, summarizes everything in the Old Testament. And so that ends the debate. Nobody can ask another question. There's one kind of final scene, one more thing I wanted to get to with the anointing at Bethany, but don't have time. But basically know that Jesus accepts a gift that is very expensive here and that causes Judas reacts against that, and then he goes to the temple and talks to the religious leaders and agrees to betray Jesus for the basic slave price of the day, for 30 silver coins. And that sets us up for next time. So we'll come back on Monday and talk about the last day of Jesus' life before crucifixion, and then his arrest and his trials. If you have any other questions, come talk to me. And otherwise, enjoy fall break.